A chalk line hides a deadly secret. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axen. Share the intrigue. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you makes every mystery richer. Now, into the story. Flaxborough was the sort of town that could make a person feel indecent merely by arriving with a suitcase. Its front gardens were clipped with modest pride, its shop windows were arranged to suggest prosperity without actually committing to it, and its people had perfected that mild, inherited expression which conveyed both welcome and caution in equal measure. Even the river, which had no great reason to hurry, drifted through with a sort of resigned civility. On Tuesday afternoon, the market hall smelled of damp wool, floor polish, and the faintly medicinal perfume of chrysanthemums. The annual autumn lecture of the Flaxborough Civic Improvement Society was not, by any rational measure, a dramatic occasion. It consisted mainly of folding chairs, a trestle table of sandwiches that were always slightly too cold, and a PowerPoint projector that had once belonged to the county council and behaved as if it resented the demotion. Yet the townsfolk came. They came because attendance was a kind of social punctuation, a comma in the weekly sentence that showed you were a person who cared about the town, or at least about being seen to care. They came to nod thoughtfully at talk of heritage drains, footpath initiatives, and the regrettable decline of brass bands. And they came, less openly, to see who else came. Councillor Mrs. Winifred Pocklington was already there, installed in the second row like a ship at anchor. She had brought a notebook and a pen, not because she intended to take notes, but because a notebook and pen suggested that she might. Her husband, Alf, sat beside her in the posture of a man who had long ago decided not to fight battles he could not name. Behind them, Mr. Lionel Henshaw, proprietor of Henshaw Stationers, and the sort of man whose moustache looked as if it had been groomed with a ruler, arranged the pamphlets on the welcome table into neat piles. He did this with a grave concentration that suggested pamphlets, if left unattended, might attempt something rash. At the front of the hall, Dr. Marcus Quill, headmaster of St. Barnabas Grammar, adjusted his tie in the mirror of his phone. Quill was in his early 50s. He had the trim, clean confidence of a man who spoke for a living and a voice that could make Latin sound like a personal kindness. He was also the only speaker the Civic Improvement Society had been able to book who did not require an honorarium beyond a plate of sandwiches. Tonight's lecture was titled The Future of Education in Market Towns. It was a safe subject. People in Flaxborough loved a safe subject almost as much as they loved the mild thrill of disagreeing about it afterward. Near the side wall, Mr. Edward Teddy Vane, retired railway clerk and self-appointed local historian, stood in debate with Miss Lorna Fitch from the library. Teddy had a habit of speaking as if giving evidence to a magistrate. Lorna had a habit of listening as if she might be called to do so. "I tell you," Teddy said, tapping the air with 2 fingers, "those new tablets won't last 5 years. Give a boy a book, he keeps it. Give him a tablet, he drops it down the lavatory. It's human nature." Miss Fitch smiled politely. In her mind she saw, with some pleasure, a line of schoolboys solemnly posting iPads into toilets like offerings to a minor god. The hall filled in gradients. There were the civic regulars, the people who attended things. There were the loose satellites, spouses, friends, reluctant neighbors dragged along for company. And there were the ones who did not attend things but had come tonight anyway, because they had heard Dr. Quill might mention the proposed expansion of St. Barnabas onto the old cricket field. That was not a safe subject at all. That was a subject with teeth, even if the teeth were worn down by years of polite use. The Improvement Society's chairwoman, Mrs. Aileen Boffin, swept to the front with the confidence of someone who had never once been uncertain about the correct spoon at a luncheon. She was a small, wiry woman with attentive eyes, the sort that always seemed to be seeing the thing behind the thing. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, tapping the microphone so hard it winced, "if we could take our seats, please. Thank you very much." Seats squeaked, Throats cleared. Someone coughed in a way that sounded, to the sensitive ear, faintly disapproving. Dr. Quill stepped forward. He smiled and let the smile settle on the room like a well-practiced cloth. As he opened his laptop, a pale shower of chalk dust drifted down from the blackboard behind him. Mrs. Pocklington frowned. "Goodness," she murmured to Alf. "They've not cleaned that properly." Alf nodded in the grave manner of a man who would rather be cleaning it himself than listening to this. Quill noticed the dust and gave a quick, apologetic gesture. "You'll forgive me. The venerable board has clearly been through a lively morning. We shall do our best to avoid a repeat performance." A mild ripple of laughter moved through the audience. It was not the kind that enjoyed itself too much. Dr. Quill began in the measured way of a man who expected to be interrupted by agreeable applause at some point and had prepared himself for it. He spoke of tradition, of opportunity, of the noble task of teaching boys to become men of character rather than merely of employment. He spoke of the need to modernize without losing one's soul, and of the soul of a market town being as delicate and stubborn as its old stones. The audience listened with the steady attention of people who felt they owed someone's future a tribute of concentration. At exactly 7 minutes past, 8, while Quill was in mid-sentence, and we must ask ourselves whether a town that neglects its children can truly claim to respect its past. There was a sharp clatter from the back of the hall. For a breath, no one moved. In Flaxborough, a clatter was often merely a clatter, and politeness demanded you give it the chance to explain itself. Then someone screamed softly. Not in terror, but in surprise that their own voice had done such a thing. A chair had toppled. A body had slid sideways into the aisle as neatly as if guided there. Mr. Lionel Henshaw lay on his back beside the pamphlet table, one arm twisted beneath him, his moustache no longer at its usual confident angle. Miss Fitch was the first to stand. She moved like a person who had catalogued enough first-aid manuals to trust herself with their contents. "Is he all right?" she said, but she was already kneeling. Mrs. Boffin hurried down the aisle. Councillor Pocklington rose more slowly, her face pinched in the kind of alarm that did not wish to be accused of excitement. Others stood, then promptly sat again, uncertain of their role in an emergency. Flaxborough did not like scenes. It liked to be helpful, but discreetly. Dr. Quill paused, still holding his remote like a small scepter. "Please, everyone remain calm. Give her space." Miss Fitch touched Henshaw's wrist. She held it longer than etiquette required. Her mouth tightened slightly, and her eyes flicked up to Mrs. Boffin with a look that was not a question. Mrs. Boffin understood at once. She had been a wartime nurse before marrying into her husband's mild fortune and the Improvement Society's stern routines. She leaned in, briskly professional, their heads bent together. "He's not breathing," Miss Fitch said quietly. The hall absorbed that sentence in a slow, reluctant wave. In the second row, Alf Pocklington looked down at his hands, as if they might be implicated. Teddy Vane stared with the avid stillness of a man collecting facts for later use. Someone at the far end muttered, "Dear me," in a tone that suggested the whole thing was slightly inconvenient to the program. Dr. Quill stepped down from the platform. He knelt with composed authority. "Has anyone called an ambulance?" A young man, one of the satellites, whose name no one present could now recall, fumbled for his phone and went pale with the responsibility. "Oh, Lord," Councillor Pocklington whispered. "Oh, poor Lionel." Poor Lionel, for his part, did not move. His face had a curious calmness to it, the kind you saw sometimes in portraits of rather dull bishops. His spectacles lay a foot from his head, one lens smeared with something that might have been polish, or might have been something else entirely. Dr. Quill checked, then sat back, his expression controlled. "We shall have to wait for the doctor." "In the meantime," Mrs. Boffin said, finding the chairwoman within herself, even now, perhaps everyone could just keep back. People shuffled. A circle widened around the fallen man like ripples around a stone. It might have ended there, in the ordinary tragedy of a sudden collapse among the civic-minded. But Flaxborough concealed its strangeness in plain sight, and sometimes death arrived with a small theatrical flourish. As the circle widened, someone noticed the blackboard behind the platform. It had been wiped that morning, imperfectly, leaving pale ghosts of writing. But now, in the wake of the chalk dust drift, there was a fresh smear along the lower left corner. A message, half-formed, as if written in haste by someone whose hand had trembled. It was not a word, more like a shape, a downward stroke, then a hook, a letter that might have been an R, or a P, or only a desperate scratch. Dr. Quill saw it too. His eyes lingered a fraction longer than they should have. He turned away quickly. In the third row, among the quiet watchers, a small woman with a knitted hat leaned toward her friend. "Did you see that board?" she whispered. "Someone's been in here after the boys. It's disgraceful." Her friend whispered back. "Maybe Lionel wrote something as he fell." "Why would he be writing? He was stacking pamphlets." "I don't know, but it looks like a letter, doesn't it? Like he was trying to tell us something." The word "something" made its way around the hall, sprouting meanings as it went. On the platform, the projector continued to throw its calm slide onto the wall. A list of bullet points about community investment in youth. It seemed, in the new context, faintly indecent. Outside, in the chill of the market square, the town went about its business for another few minutes, unaware that the civic order had been disturbed. A bus hissed at the curb. A butcher locked up with ritual care. A dog inspected the base of the war memorial with thoughtful disdain. And in the police station down by Booth Street, Inspector Purbright was finishing a cup of tea in the unhurried belief that Tuesday evenings belonged, as they always had, to paperwork and quiet. He would learn, presently, that Flaxborough had produced a death at a lecture, a scatter of chalk dust, and a small puzzling mark on a blackboard, and that the town had already begun to decide what it all meant. For now, the market hall waited, holding its breath with the rest of them, as if politeness alone might coax Mr. Henshaw back into it. The ambulance arrived with apologetic haste, its siren swelling only when it could no longer be ignored. 2 attendants came in, damp from the square and already alert to the stillness that met them. They worked at Mr. Henshaw with quick, practiced movements, collar opened, mask fitted, stethoscope pressed, a brief, murmured exchange. The young attendant looked once at Miss Fitch and found in her face no encouragement for hope. Dr. Quill stood aside, holding his remote, as if it was suddenly inappropriate to have hands at all. Mrs. Boffin hovered near the aisle, her chairwoman's composure rattling but not yet broken. Councillor Pocklington, having risen, remained standing in the conscientious way of someone uncertain whether to be a witness, a mourner, or a nuisance. After a minute, the older attendant straightened, shoulders settling into a small, unarguable posture. He shook his head to his colleague. There was no ceremony in it, only the blunt finality of routine. The hall took in the meaning slowly. The coughs stopped. The whispering paused. Dr. Quill closed his eyes once, a man snatching a breath he had forgotten to take. "Well," Mrs. Boffin said too briskly, "I think we ought to let everyone go home. There's no point in keeping people here." She had nearly said "carrying on" and managed to avoid it by sheer force of upbringing. Chairs scraped, coats were collected. People drifted toward the doors in little knots that formed and reformed as revelations required. Several moved automatically to the pamphlet table, then stopped short at the sight of the toppled chair and scattered leaflets. Teddy Vane edged nearer to the blackboard behind the platform. Chalk dust still clung to its ledge. At the lower left corner, a fresh smear had been made, a downward stroke with a hooked tail. Something that might have been a letter, or might have been only the accidental scarring of a sleeve. "You notice that?" he whispered to Miss Fitch, who lingered beside him. "Yes." Could be from earlier, of course. The boys. Could be. But look how sharp it is. No smudging, and there's loose chalk on the ledge. His tone held the satisfaction of a man fitting a loose piece into a puzzle that did not yet have a picture. Miss Fitch did not answer. Her attention had shifted to Dr. Quill, who was packing his laptop with care slightly too deliberate. Councillor Pocklington swept up, her distress already arranging itself into memory. "Oh, it's dreadful, isn't it? Lionel always seemed so steady. I dare say it was his heart." "Had he complained of anything lately?" Miss Fitch asked. "Not exactly. He looked a bit peaky at the fete last week, but then he'd been minding that stall in full sun, and he did mention a terrible bother at the shop. Parking, I think. They've been after him about those new bays. Lionel could get quite worked up when he thought the council were meddling." Teddy brightened. "Ah, the parking scheme. I warned them. Henshaw's depended on decent footfall." "Footfall didn't kill him," Mrs. Pocklington said sharply, then softened. "Still, there will be talk." Outside, the market square had gone slick with drizzle. Under the hall's awning, clusters of townsfolk lingered, reluctant to disperse before their impressions had been checked against other people's. Sergeant Lovejoy arrived with a constable, both men wearing the slightly delayed air of police called to something that has already decided its own ending. Lovejoy nodded to Mrs. Boffin, offered a quiet word to the attendants, then began asking questions in a voice that tried not to become the center of the evening. "You were speaking when he collapsed, Doctor?" he asked Dr. Quill. "Yes, he was at the back by the table. One moment he was standing there, and the next he was on the floor. I didn't see any warning." "No argument? No disturbance?" "None at all." Lovejoy turned to Miss Fitch. "You got to him first?" "I was near. I checked his pulse. There wasn't one. We'll need names of people close by." Teddy leaned in as if summoned. "I was 6 seats away on the aisle. Mrs. Slater was behind him. Peter Chubb from the butcher's was fetching a sandwich and saw him go down, and old Mr. Jarvis was at the pamphlets a minute before." Lovejoy wrote, "All right, statements later. For now, everyone should go home. If anything unusual comes back to you, a remark, a stranger, a smell, tell Inspector Purbright." At Purbright's name, the little groups shifted, some with relief, some with eagerness. Flaxborough trusted Purbright's quiet way with a wary, hopeful affection. Dr. Quill's gaze flicked toward the blackboard. "Unusual," he repeated softly. "Anything that doesn't fit," Lovejoy said. "No," Quill replied after a pause. "Nothing occurs to me." He buttoned his coat and walked out into the drizzle without haste. Miss Fitch watched him go with a faint librarian sense of misshelving. The attendants lifted the sheeted body onto the stretcher and wheeled it down the aisle. People stepped back politely. The door closed behind the stretcher with a dull sound that left the hall suddenly larger and more vacant. Lovejoy lingered. He crossed to the blackboard, crouched, and ran a finger over the chalky ledge. Dust clung to his skin. He studied the hooked smear, then looked at the platform, the projector still throwing its bullet points about community investment, now faintly impertinent. He straightened and said to the constable, "Ring the station. Tell Inspector Purbright we've got a sudden death at the market hall, probably natural but not quite tidy, and tell him about that mark." The constable trotted off. Lovejoy stepped into the square again, where the last knots of townspeople were already walking home, their heads together, their voices low and lively. Somewhere among those voices a neat explanation was forming, as explanations always did in Flaxborough. And somewhere else, less audible, a different story was waiting to be found. Inspector Purbright arrived at the market hall at 8:35 after finishing the cup of tea he hadn't much wanted and locking a drawer that didn't strictly need locking. The drizzle had thickened into honest rain. He walked in without umbrella, his hat doing the small, respectable work hats are asked to do in market towns. Sergeant Lovejoy met him under the awning. "Evening, sir. It's Mr. Henshaw. Dropped at the lecture. Ambulance took him in, but they were certain on the floor." Dr. Quill was speaking. "No fuss. Folk are already saying heart." Purbright nodded. "And you weren't?" "Natural's likely, but there are a couple of bits." Lovejoy guided him inside. Chairs stood skewed where people had risen in a hurry. A plate of sandwiches sat on the trestle like an abandoned promise. Where did he fall? By the pamphlet table. Lovejoy pointed. The body was gone, leaving only the minor violence of disarranged chairs. "And the mark?" Lovejoy led him to the platform and the blackboard. On the lower left corner was the hooked stroke, darker than the older smears beneath it. Purbright leaned closer. He did not touch the board. "Fresh enough," he said. "Too deliberate to be a sleeve. Too clumsy to be a letter. Could he have done it as he went down? Some kind of last message?" Purbright smiled faintly. "People incline to last messages. They make translation easier." He examined the chalk tray. A few fat sticks lay beside a damp rag. "Any snapped chalk on the floor?" "We swept a bit, sir. Didn't want the cleaners trampling anything. Nothing obvious." Purbright looked round, letting the room talk quietly at him. The fall sounded, by everyone's account, like a simple collapse. Yet the shape on the board suggested someone had been close to it minutes before the lecture began. That might mean nothing. He turned back to Lovejoy. Who was close to him? Miss Fitch from the library got to him first. Dr. Quill checked him. Councillor Pocklington was there, and Teddy Vane. There were a dozen more about. I've got names. Good. They can be spoken to tomorrow. Tonight we'll do the small work. Purbright went to the pamphlet table and lifted one leaflet. It was an Improvement Society circular about footpaths and the proposed school extension. These leaflets? Who arranged them? Henshaw did. Brought them, stacked them at 7. Anyone touch them after? Mrs. Boffin leafed through one. A couple of folk picked at them while Quill talked, but Henshaw was standing right here most of the time. Purbright set the leaflet down. How is he about the school plan? Not keen. Said the new wing would choke the high street with cars and that the council never asked shopkeepers before deciding. But he was polite, if you can call Lionel polite when he's annoyed. Polite annoyance can still be annoyance. Purbright walked to the coat pegs. A single umbrella remained. He opened it. Cheap black with a silver tip. A label inside read Henshaw Stationers. He left it. At the side door a woman waited, gripping her handbag. "Mrs. Slater," Lovejoy mouthed. Purbright approached her with soft gravity. "Mrs. Slater, thank you for staying." "Oh, Inspector. I only live round the corner. I didn't like to go off when poor Lionel was... Well," she swallowed. "It was awful." "You were behind him when he fell?" "Yes. Last row. I saw him swaying a bit like he'd turned to say something, and then the chair went. He went down very quick. No cry, no clutching. Just down." "Did he speak to anyone before the lecture?" "He spoke to Dr. Quill. I couldn't hear, but Dr. Quill came over to the table, and Lionel said something in that clipped way he had when he meant business." Quill nodded, smiled, and went back up front. Lionel looked cross after. Cross because of what he said, or because of what he'd heard? Oh, I couldn't tell. Lionel could look cross when the weather was agreeable. She tried a small laugh that failed politely, but he wasn't cross with me. He said good evening. Purbright let that settle. Anyone else approach the table? A young lad, Peter Chubb's boy, came for a sandwich and Lionel waved him on, and Miss Fitch was there earlier. Lionel joked about library fines, that's all. Thank you. He did not add anything else. When she had gone, Purbright returned to Lovejoy. Quill spoke to him just before. That connects them, if only by timing. We'll speak to Quill first thing. Meanwhile, I want the board photographed and the chalk tray taken in, and find out who used the hall this afternoon. If the mark's older, we forget it. If it's from tonight, we don't." "Right, sir." Purbright stood once more in the aisle, looking at the platform after the actors had left. He imagined the room alive again, the mild rustling, Henshaw by his pamphlets like a guardian of paper. Somewhere in that ordinary picture lay the moment when a tidy death had become slightly untidy. Untidiness, he thought, was often how truth asked to be noticed. Lovejoy went to the door to speak to the constable on duty, leaving Purbright alone for a moment. He walked back to the pamphlet table and bent, sniffing once, discreetly. There was floor polish, damp wood, and the faint tang of turpentine from the hall's cleaning cupboard. Nothing sharper. Still, he noted a dusting of pale powder on the table's edge, finer than the chalk on the ledge, as if brushed from a sleeve. He rubbed it between finger and thumb, then wiped his hand on his coat with mild distaste. He wondered who had been leaning there earlier. Outside, rain pattered on the awning. Flaxborough was already carrying the story home, tucking it into suppers and whispers. By morning, some version of it would be fixed in the town's mind. Purbright's task, as ever, would be to find the version that had actually happened. By 9 o'clock, the market hall had been locked, Lovejoy carrying away the chalk tray in a paper bag as if it might bruise. Purbright walked back through the square at the pace of a man who had nowhere else to be and knew it. The rain had eased into a fine, persistent mist that made the street lamps fuzzy round the edges. In the butcher's window, a row of sausages shone with modest ambition. Across the road, the chemist had closed early, its blinds pulled down with the sort of decisiveness people associated with prudence. Flaxborough was settling to sleep, but it did so with one eye open. The death of a man in public was never quite private, and Mr. Henshaw had been a public man in the town's quiet register. He had sold them pens, notebooks, birthday cards, and raffle tickets. He had sponsored the cricket team by supplying scorebooks at cost. He had told children, sternly but not unkindly, that chewing pencils was not the same as thinking. A death like that belonged to everyone in a small way. At the station, Purbright found the night sergeant nursing a mug of cocoa for reasons that were his own. He went into his office, hung his hat, and sat down. The desk lamp made a small circle in which thoughts could behave. He opened the log Lovejoy had started, read it twice, then placed it beside his blotter as if it might decide to leave. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. Lovejoy's voice reached him with the faint distortion of damp air. "Sir, just had a call from county. Doctor at A&E says they'll do a post-mortem tomorrow. But he mentioned something. There was mild irritation around the lips. Not enough to say anything definite, but he says it isn't typical of a straightforward collapse." Purbright's pen paused. "Irritation. Redness. Like contact with something. He says could be nothing, could be something he'd eaten. But he thought you'd want it." "I do. Thank you." Purbright replaced the receiver gently, as if he were putting down a sleeping child. Irritation around the lips could mean a dozen small, ordinary things. An allergy to pineapple in a sandwich, a reaction to a new denture cleaner, the careless enthusiasm of an aftershave. Yet the fact that a doctor thought to mention it pushed the death a fraction away from heart. The fraction was enough to merit another look. He wrote, "Lips irritated, possible ingestion." Then, beneath it, without quite knowing why, chalk dust on sleeve. He sat back. Across town, Dr. Quill was arriving home to a narrow house on Casterbridge Road. He was a man who liked a quiet, ordered evening after a public performance. His habits were made of careful folds. He hung his coat in the hall and stood for a moment in the dim light, listening to the house's silence. His wife was in Leeds for a conference. There was no one to offer a first reaction to the evening, and this, unexpectedly, made it harder to organize his own. In the kitchen, he poured himself a whiskey he had not intended to drink. He carried it into the sitting room, turned on a lamp, and found that his hand was faintly trembling. He set the glass down and looked at it as if unsure whether it had done him a discourtesy. The lecture had been going well, better than well. He had felt the room with him, nodding in its mild Flaxborough way, and he had been pleased with his own gentleness. Then the clatter, the body, the stillness, and Lionel Henshaw's face turned slack in a way Quill could not forget. He saw again the moment by the pamphlet table before his talk. Lionel had said, low and clipped, "I want to know why you've been asking after my accounts, Quill. I'm not a boy in your classroom." Quill had smiled because it was easier than correcting the man's tone. "No one is asking after your accounts, Lionel. Don't try it. Mr. Jarvis told me you've been nosing about. The council's got its hands full without you poking your stick in. There must be a misunderstanding." Quill had kept his voice even. "Perhaps you're thinking of someone else." Lionel had leaned closer. Quill had smelt ink and peppermint and that faint dry odor books acquire when they're kept too lovingly. "If you think you can push that extension through by leaning on shopkeepers, you're mistaken. I keep my own books, and you won't be counting them." In the end, Quill had said nothing that could be held to him. He had nodded mildly and walked away. Lionel had been alive then. The thought made Quill's throat tighten. He went to the window and looked out at the wet street. A bus passed, hissing. He had no prayer to say, so he stood in silence until he felt it had done the job of one. Meanwhile, in a semi-detached on Lark Rise, Mrs. Pocklington was already constructing the evening into its proper social shape. She had telephoned 3 friends and 1 cousin, repeating each time that she could hardly believe it, though by the 4th telling she had begun to believe it with a certain fluency. "It was odd, if you ask me," she said into the receiver to Mrs. Daly, who ran the florists. "No warning, and there was chalk everywhere. I know it sounds silly, but people were saying there was a sort of mark on the board, like he tried to write something. I mean, what could he have tried to write? Help! Quill! It puts ideas in your head." "Was there anyone strange there?" Mrs. Daly asked. "Oh no, all the usuals. Though I did see that Jarvis man. You know, with the car lot. He was hovering by the sandwiches. If Lionel had a disagreement with anyone, it would be over money." Mrs. Pocklington had no more evidence than that, but evidence was not what Flaxborough used to move a story along. She added with gentle relish, "You know Lionel never took to Dr. Quill, thought he was too slippery, too clever by half." "Did he say that?" "Well, he didn't say it in so many words, but one could tell." Across the town, those ingredients, money, Quill, a mark on the board, were already mixing in other kitchens, other sitting rooms. By supper time tomorrow they would have set into something that looked like a conclusion. Purbright, absent from these conversations, nevertheless felt their pressure as if it were weather. He knew Flaxborough's appetite for neatness. It was not malicious, it was a kind of civic tidiness. It wanted deaths to be hearts, thieves to be outsiders, scandals to be misunderstandings. The town hated loose ends because loose ends had a way of tangling round reputations. He went to the window of his office and looked down Booth Street. A cyclist went by with his coat flapping like an uncertain flag. Somewhere, not far off, a radio played dance music at a volume intended to reassure someone of youth. Everything ordinary persisted. But that persistence, he had learned, was often the best disguise for the extraordinary. He picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Quill's number from memory. It rang 6 times before Quill answered, voice composed but fractionally delayed, like a man arriving at himself. "Quill here. Inspector Purbright, I'm sorry to disturb you this late." "Oh, Inspector. Of course. No disturbance. I won't keep you. I wanted to ask while the evening is fresh. Did Mr. Henshaw say anything to you before your lecture?" There was a pause long enough to be honest or strategic. Purbright did not decide which. "He said good evening. He made some remark about the projector never working properly. Nothing more." "I see. And did you notice him complain of feeling unwell?" "No, not at all." "Thank you. We'll speak tomorrow if needed. Good night." "Good night, Inspector." Purbright put down the receiver and wrote neatly, "Quill says nothing said." Others say brief talk, discrepancy. He did not underline it. Underlining, he thought, was for people who wished to be certain too early. The rain began again, tapping at the station's windows in a polite, persistent rhythm. Purbright sat in it, patient as ever, and let the small contradictions line up in his mind like townspeople waiting for a bus. Somewhere among them was the one who didn't quite belong. Morning came to Flaxborough with that pale, undecided light which suggested the town had woken but not yet committed to the day. The rain had washed the cobbles clean of last night's hurry. Only a damp scatter of cigarette ends by the market hall hinted that anything unusual had happened there at all. Inspector Purbright arrived at Henshaw's stationer's at 9:10. The shop stood between a bakery and a draper's, its window arranged with careful symmetry. Fountain pens in a velvet tray, school exercise books piled into stiff little towers, a cardboard display of Christmas cards that had crept forward earlier, each year, until it now arrived with the first hint of autumn. The bell over the door gave a mild tinkle as Purbright entered. Inside, the shop smelled of paper, ink, and those pink erasers that always seemed to have a faint taste of peppermint even before anyone chewed them. Behind the counter, Mrs. Joyce Henshaw stood very straight, as if posture could hold grief at bay. She was a thin, neat woman in her late 40s, hair pinned back so tightly that one suspected it might have been done in anger years before and never loosened. "Inspector Purbright," she said before he could speak. She had a voice that belonged to a person used to being listened to by children and salesmen alike. "I thought you'd come." "I'm sorry to bother you so soon, Mrs. Henshaw." He removed his hat, letting the gesture do some of the work words could not. "May I sit?" She nodded to a chair by a small desk at the side. The desk was a place where Lionel had evidently written invoices and municipal letters with equal severity. His spectacles lay there, one lens still smeared from last night. Mrs. Henshaw had not moved them. She had probably not dared. Purbright sat. "How are you this morning?" "Oh, I'm not falling apart, if that's what you mean." She said it with a briskness that did not deny emotion so much as ration it. It was a shock, of course. But Lionel always said there was no sense in turning a tragedy into a pantomime, and he would have hated all this fuss. People will fuss. They feel they must do something. Purbright paused. Was Lionel in good health? He had indigestion. Everyone in this town has indigestion. The doctor told him to ease up on bacon, so naturally he decided to buy smoked bacon and say it was different. Her mouth tightened. But no heart trouble. Nothing like that. Did he mention feeling unwell yesterday? No. He left here at 6:30 with the leaflets under his arm and a mouthful of complaints about the council. He was full of himself, if anything. Complaints about the council? She gave a small snort. That parking scheme. You know the one. New bays for the school run. Yellow lines by our corner. Lionel said it was the thin end of a wedge. Even got a petition going. She opened a drawer, took out a stack of signatures neatly clipped. There. 243 names. He was terribly proud of that number. He said if Winifred Pocklington didn't listen to 200 people, perhaps she'd listen to a dead shopkeeper. She froze at her own words, then looked past Purbright's shoulder as if the shop had suddenly rearranged itself. Purbright said gently, "Did he have any particular quarrels over it?" "Only the usual ones. Dr. Quill, for a start. Wanted the school extension, didn't he? Lionel said Quill was marching through town as if it were his private corridor. Still, it was all civil. Lionel never shouted. He cut. That was his way. Did he fear anyone was trying to pressure him? No, he feared they were trying to ignore him." She folded her hands on the desk. "Inspector, are you asking because you think he wasn't just taken?" "I'm asking because I don't know yet what I think. Not properly." Purbright let a silence open, not to be cruel but to allow space for recollection to walk in. Mrs. Henshaw blinked, and something that had been held tight behind her eyes slid forward. "There was one thing," she said. "It sounds nothing." But last week he came home with chalk on his sleeve. White dust. I said, "What have you been doing, writing on walls?" And he said, "If I start writing on walls, Joyce, it'll be because no one reads letters." He was irritated. That's all. But Lionel didn't chalk things. He hated mess. Purbright's pen moved. Chalk from where? He didn't say. I assumed he'd been in the hall, perhaps, for that meeting. Or at the school. He wouldn't tell me. He said it was none of my business, which usually meant it was council business. Did he ever mention Mr. Jarvis? The car lot man. Yes, he called in now and again for receipt books. Lionel disliked him. Said he had a way of selling a car twice in one conversation. But that isn't a quarrel. That's taste. Purbright nodded. He looked at the shop around them, the exactness of the shelves, the stubborn order. A man who liked order might be particularly offended by the sort of disorder that hides inside ledgers. "One last thing," he said. "Did Lionel take any food or drink to the lecture?" "No, why would he? The Improvement Society put out sandwiches. He always said their ham was like filing paper." She gave a short laugh that cracked at the end. "Oh, Inspector, he said that yesterday morning. That phrase exactly. Isn't it odd, the things you remember?" "Not odd at all." Purbright stood. "Thank you, Mrs. Henshaw. If anything else occurs to you, however small, will you ring me?" She nodded, but her gaze slid to the spectacles on the desk again, and her jaw set as if she were about to take on the entire town at once. Outside, Purbright found Lovejoy waiting by the car, notebook already open. "Post-mortem is scheduled for 2, sir. Dr. Ricketts wants you there if you can." "I can." Purbright took a breath of cold air. "Joyce Henshaw says Lionel came home last week with chalk dust on his sleeve. He wouldn't explain it." Lovejoy's eyebrows lifted. "So the mark on the board could tie to something earlier." "Possibly. It also means the dust on the table last night might not be incidental." Purbright looked across the street. A schoolboy hurried past in a blazer too large at the shoulders, scattering drops from his umbrella like a dog shaking itself. "Let's go to St. Barnabas. If Lionel was in their halls with chalk on him, it's as well to know why." St. Barnabas Grammar rose on a slight hill beyond the square, a red brick statement of confidence built in a time when confidence had been cheaper. In the entrance hall, a portrait of the founder stared down in moral disappointment at the modern world. The matron intercepted them with swift propriety and led them to Dr. Quill's office. Quill stood when they entered, face smooth, hands folded loosely behind his back. He wore the expression of a man who believes in the cleanliness of his own motives but has learned that other people may wish to inspect them anyway. "Inspector, Sergeant, please sit." Purbright settled into the chair opposite. "I'm afraid I must ask again about last night. We've had word that Mr. Henshaw spoke with you just before your lecture." Quill's eyes widened a fraction, then narrowed to courtesy. He said, "Good evening. If that constitutes a conversation, Flaxborough's standards have fallen even further than I feared." Mrs. Slater heard something more pointed. A faint shadow passed over Quill's mouth. "Mrs. Slater hears pointed things in the way some people hear music. Mr. Henshaw was a critic of the school extension. He enjoyed being so. He may have offered me a remark. I don't recollect specifics." Purbright watched him with mild interest. "Did you speak to him recently about his shop accounts or petition?" Quill looked almost amused. "Why on earth would I?" "Because Mr. Henshaw thought you had." For the first time, Quill's composure moved. Not much. Just a slight stiffening at the shoulders, as if his spine had been reminded of duty. "That is absurd. I have neither the time nor the inclination to meddle in a stationer's bookkeeping. If Mr. Henshaw believed otherwise, he was mistaken." "Did you ever meet him in the market hall last week?" "No." "Did he ever come here?" Quill paused. "He came to the school on Friday. He wanted to see the governor's clerk about the parking scheme." I told him she was busy and that the proper route was through the council. He was displeased, but I did not invite him in, if that's what you're implying." Purbright nodded as if storing a postcard. "When he came, was anyone else present?" "The caretaker saw him in the foyer. And 2 boys, I imagine." "It was lunchtime? And was there a blackboard or notice board he might have written on?" Quill's gaze flicked almost unwillingly to the corner of his office. There stood a portable chalkboard on wheels with the words, "Stay Barnabas. Discipline is freedom," written in severe block capitals. "He could have scribbled something on that if he were so minded," Quill said. "But he was not. He left within 5 minutes." Purbright waited. Quill met his eyes steadily now, a man stepping onto firm ground after a wobble. Purbright rose. "Thank you, Doctor. I'll not detain you." He moved toward the door, then turned as if on an afterthought. One small matter. Do you use chalk here, or have you moved to whiteboard markers?" Quill blinked. "Chalk. We're not a polytechnic." "Quite." Purbright smiled politely and left. In the corridor, Lovejoy exhaled. "He didn't like that, sir." "No, but he answered." Purbright stepped out into the chilly yard, where boys shouted at a football with the pure faith of youth that goals are permanent. "Lionel came here Friday. He left annoyed. He picked up chalk dust somehow, and last night he collapsed in front of a fresh chalk mark." Purbright did not say what he was thinking. He rarely did. "Let's find the caretaker. After that, we'll go to the mortuary and hear what Lionel has to tell us when he's finished being quiet." The caretaker turned out to be Mr. Sidney Rook, a wiry man with the complexion of someone who spent his days in boiler rooms and his evenings in allotments. Purbright found him in a narrow office that smelled of paraffin, damp coats, and a faintly heroic struggle against adolescence. Rook rose halfway, then sat again when Purbright waved him to ease. "Inspector, something about Lionel Henshaw, is it? Terrible business." "You saw him here on Friday, Mr. Rook?" "Yes, sir. Came in with that petition under his arm, looking like he'd swallowed a wasp. He does get a face on him when he thinks he's right." Rook looked mournful. "He asked for the clerk, didn't he? I said she was in a governor's meeting. He didn't like that." "Where did he stand while he waited?" "Just there by the board in the foyer." Rook pointed through the open door to the entrance hall. The portable chalkboard Quill had indicated stood in its corner, dutifully stern. "Did he touch it?" "Not that I saw, but he was close enough. He leaned on the frame a bit. I thought he might tip it, so I said, 'Careful, Mr. Henshaw, that thing's older than me.' He said, 'It might be wiser than you and all.' And then he wiped a smudge off his coat." Rook smiled sadly. "He did get chalk on him, yes." Purbright nodded. "Did he say anything while he was there? Anything about someone else or some difficulty?" "Only that Quill was playing the lord of the manor and that the school didn't own the town. He said it loud enough for the boys to hear, which I didn't much like. I told him to mind his language, and he said, 'Language is all I've got left.'" Rook's eyes dropped. He went off without seeing anyone. Said he'd take it higher. He did say one other thing. "What was that?" Rook scratched his chin. He said, "If they won't read my figures, perhaps they'll read them on a wall?" I thought he was being theatrical. That was Lionel, though. Theatrical in a tidy box. Purbright glanced toward the chalkboard. "What figures?" Rook shrugged. "Parking figures. Petitions. Who knows? He said things like that when he was worked up." "Thank you." Purbright rose, letting the conversation close gently. "If anything else returns to you, do ring Sergeant Lovejoy." Outside, Lovejoy waited under the eaves. "So he did get chalk here, and spoke of writing on walls." Purbright's eyes traced the rain, gutter, the brickwork dark with wet. It may have been only a phrase, but Lionel's phrases seemed to circle the same idea. Lovejoy frowned. "What idea's that, sir?" Purbright did not answer at once. The boys in the yard were still playing football, shrieking at one another with cheerful cruelty. One could believe, watching them, that the world involved no more than tackles and temporary injustice. He believed something was being ignored, Purbright said at last. We must find what it was. They drove to County Hospital for the post-mortem, the roads slick and the hedgerows glossy with a stripped late autumn green. In the car, Lovejoy reported the morning's gossip because Purbright liked to know what a town was telling itself. Mrs. Daly says Lionel and Jarvis had a row over a bad debt. Mrs. Pocklington says Quill threatened Lionel about the petition. Teddy Vane says Lionel had new evidence about the school extension. Everyone says Hart. Everyone says what is easiest. Purbright looked out at a field where a pony stood miserably in drizzle. What do you say? I say it's too quick to say anything. Purbright smiled approvingly, not at Lovejoy's caution, but at his growth in it. Dr. Ricketts met them in the mortuary corridor with a clipboard and sleeves rolled up. He was a small, plump man with a fresh, alert face and hands that were always apologetic about their job. Morning, Inspector. I'll spare you the delicate bits. Cause of death is not cardiac. It's poisoning. Lovejoy made a sound between surprise and annoyance. Purbright only lifted his brows. Poisoning by what? He asked. Likely cyanide compound. Ricketts tapped the paper. We've sent samples to the lab for confirmation. There was characteristic irritation at the mouth and throat, and a faint bitter almond odor in the stomach contents. He died quickly. Very quickly. Purbright nodded slowly. Ingested, not inhaled. Almost certainly ingested. There's no lung irritation. Whatever he took was swallowed. Liquid or powder. Time to death? Within minutes of ingestion. 5 to 10, perhaps. Not longer. Purbright's mind rearranged last night's picture. Lionel at the pamphlet table, the lecture starting, the clatter at 8:07. A narrow window, a small, ordinary act inside it. Did you find anything else? Needle marks? No. Nothing to suggest injection. No injuries beyond the fall. Ricketts hesitated. Inspector, in your experience, could this have been suicide? It could, Purbright said. But it could also be made to look like one. We'll see which human nature favors. He inclined his head. Thank you, Doctor. In the corridor, Lovejoy let out his breath. Poisoned, Lord? Yes. Purbright's voice was mild, but his eyes were thoughtful. And in a way that suggests he didn't know it. Cyanide isn't the sort of thing one takes by accident unless someone has helped. Sandwiches? Possible, but many ate those sandwiches. No one else collapsed. Drink, then. Tea. He might have had a cup from the urn. He might, but he was running the table. He'd take tea the way he took everything, standing, distracted. If it was tea, the window for tampering was narrow. Purbright walked a few paces, stopping where the corridor window gave a view of the car park, grey with puddles. He also didn't bring anything from home. Lovejoy frowned. Unless someone brought it to him. Or offered it. Purbright's fingers tapped his notebook lightly. A peppermint? Lionel liked peppermint, by Quill's account. A lozenge. A small kindness. We mustn't overlook the smallness. Back at the station, they found a message waiting. Teddy Vane had rung twice and would ring again unless discouraged. Purbright asked for him to be shown in at once. Teddy arrived 10 minutes later with the air of a man bringing both sympathy and a press release. Inspector, I'm very glad you've sent for me. Terrible about Lionel, but I've been thinking... Oh, Purbright said pleasantly. Last night, after everyone left, I went back for my scarf. I saw something I didn't mention before. Teddy leaned forward, his eyes lively. There was a little brown bottle under the pamphlet table. I didn't pick it up, mind, but it was there, like a medicine bottle. I thought perhaps it was Lionel's. But then Lovejoy came, and I didn't want to be a nuisance. Purbright's face did not change. "You're certain it was there?" "As certain as one can be in a damp hole. It was small, with a white label. I assumed it was indigestion drops. Lionel was always swallowing those when he got in a temper." "Did you see anyone place it there?" "No, but I saw someone near the table before the lecture started. A woman, short, wearing a knitted hat. I don't know her name. She was fussing about the leaflets." "A knitted hat," Purbright repeated. "Yes, one of those floral ones." She leaned over, then went off to sit down. Lionel came back and stood there straight away. Purbright wrote in his tidy hand. Small brown bottle under table, short woman in knitted hat near leaflets pre-lecture. He looked up. "Did this woman speak to him?" "Tried to. He waved her off. That's Lionel. Busy being busy." Purbright said, "Thank you, Mr. Vane. You've been very helpful." Teddy swelled faintly. "Anything for the town, Inspector?" "Anything." When he had gone, Lovejoy said quietly, "Knitted hat woman could be Mrs. Ivy Preece. She always wears those." He rifled a card index. "She's a member of the Improvement Society. Lives on Jubilee Crescent." "Then we'll speak to her," Purbright said, "and we'll search the hall properly. If there was a bottle, we need it." "Who'd poison him with a bottle under a table, sir?" Purbright walked to the window, where Booth Street was already bustling with late morning errands. "Someone who believed he'd take it without question," he said. "Someone who knew his habits, or someone who wanted the poison found to say something even after Lionel no longer could." He turned back to Lovejoy with that patient, politely probing look that made people feel listened to and sometimes cornered without ever seeing the walls. "We'll go to the market hall now, and then Jubilee Crescent. The town is telling itself a story about Quill and petitions. Let's find out whether Lionel was trying to tell a different one in chalk dust and a bottle no one was meant to notice." They reached the market hall just after 11. The cleaner, Mrs. Armitage, was on her knees by the stage steps with a bucket, and the sort of look that implied untidiness was a moral weakness. She heaved herself up, wiping her hands on her apron as if opinions might smear. "Morning, Inspector. I've not touched that corner, like Sergeant told me. Feels sinful, leaving a mess in God's own hall." "I'm grateful," Purbright said. "Mr. Vane mentioned a small brown bottle under the pamphlet table. We'd like to see whether anything remains." "Bottle?" she sniffed. "Half the town's been nosing about since last night. If there was one, it's either gone or being talked about at breakfast. Still, this way." She led them to the back. The pamphlet table was folded against the wall, leaving a raw rectangle of scuffed boards. Purbright crouched, scanning the grain with unhurried care. Damp footprints, chair scratches, a rabbit scatter of crumbs. No bottle, but near the skirting he saw a neat, pale ring, as if something had stood there briefly and seeped. Lovejoy bent. "Spilt tea?" "Perhaps." Purbright dampened a handkerchief from the bucket, rubbed the ring, and drew a faint yellow stain. "We'll have a scraping taken and sent. If cyanide was here, it may leave a trace." Mrs. Armitage brightened at finally having something to dislike properly. "I'll tell you what left a trace. People. Teddy Vane stepped over my mop twice without seeing it." "Twice?" Purbright let that pass. "Did you notice Mrs. Ivy Preece near the leaflets before the lecture?" "Noticed her. I'd notice Ivy in a fog. She was bobbing about with that knitted hat of hers, trying to put her own biscuits on my table. Said the sandwiches were damp, as if damp killed people." She lowered her voice. Lionel waved her off sharp. She didn't like that. Purbright thanked her, asked her to keep the hall closed, and moved to the platform. The hooked chalk mark still sat at the lower left of the board, fresh against older ghosts. He studied it as motion rather than letter. Downstroke, hook, stop. A beginning without a finish. If Lionel had held chalk, he must have done so with purpose. He disliked mess almost as much as Mrs. Armitage did. Sample from the tray as well? Lovejoy asked. Yes, and start discreet inquiries about cyanide purchases, pharmacies, photo suppliers, farm stores. It turns up where one least expects it. They drove to Jubilee Crescent, a tidy loop of semis with clipped hedges and lawns combed into respectability. Mrs. Ivy Priest's house displayed a painted stone frog by the step and a brass nameplate that suggested she mistrusted memory. She opened the door before Lovejoy knocked. Inspector Purbright, I expected you. Lionel's death wasn't right. Not right at all. She ushered them into a sitting room busy with photographs of fates and grandchildren. A budgerigar watched from a cage in chilly judgment. Mrs. Priest herself was small, round, and fiercely animated, her floral knitted hat still on indoors as if it were armor. I'll say it plain, she began. Lionel was murdered. He didn't have the constitution to die politely. Purbright said mildly, the post-mortem suggests poisoning. Mr. Vane says he saw you by the pamphlet table before the lecture. Of course I was by it. I helped set it up. Mrs. Boffin forgets leaflets unless I breathe down her neck. I straightened a pile. That's all. You didn't place a bottle underneath? Her eyes widened in honest offense. Bottle? No. I had a tin of ginger biscuits in my bag. I offered one to Lionel, and he snapped, Not now, Ivy. As if I were a nuisance. I'm sorry he's dead, Inspector, but he wasn't easy. Was anyone else at the table with you? Only Miss Fitch gliding past, smiling at everybody, and Mr. Jarvis hovering by the urn, pretending to read. Her mouth thinned. He's got no business at Improvement Society things, except to count who owes him money. Jarvis was there before the lecture started? Yes, and Lionel saw him. Told him the petition wasn't for the likes of him. They had words, quiet ones, but you could feel the frost. Jarvis went red and stalked off. What words, if you recall? Mrs. Priest leaned in, delighted to be precise. Lionel said, You've had your fill already, Jarvis. Jarvis said, Not as much as you think, Henshaw. Then Lionel said, The figures will add up sooner or later. Jarvis laughed and said, Figures can be arranged. Nasty little laugh, too. Purbright's face grew attentive. Did Lionel mention Jarvis earlier in the week? He mentioned exposing someone. Said Flaxborough was being cheated under its nose. He had papers, proper papers, and if Quill and the council didn't stop bullying, he'd show them at the lecture. I asked who, and he said, Someone who'll choke on the truth. I thought he was being dramatic. Where are those papers now? I don't know. He didn't trust Joyce with business, kept things in the shop safe or in that horrible leather case he carried. He had it last night. Purbright nodded slowly. One more detail. Did you smell almonds or anything sharp near the table? Only damp ham. But Lionel did take tea from the urn after Jarvis stomped away, burned his tongue and swore under his breath. He never swore in public unless he was rattled. Purbright rose. Thank you, Mrs. Priest. Please don't discuss this just yet. She snorted. In Flaxborough, asking folk not to talk is like asking the river not to run, but I'll try. Back in the car, Lovejoy said, Jarvis, then? Jarvis makes a noise at the right time, Purbright replied. But noise isn't proof. We'll see what those papers were, and why Lionel thought truth needed chalk and threats. He looked back at the Crescent's wet pavements, thinking how quickly a quarrel over figures could turn lethal. Then he started the engine and went to find Jarvis before the town did. They found Peter Jarvis at Jarvis Motors, a low sprawl of corrugated sheds on the East Road where the town thinned into fields. A row of second-hand cars stood in obedient angles, their windscreens wearing price cards like faint smiles. Jarvis himself was in the showroom, wiping an already clean bonnet with a cloth that had seen better decades. He was a man of broad shoulders and narrow patience, hair oiled into place, teeth too white for Flaxborough's taste. Inspector, he said, with a friendliness that had corners. What can I do for the law? Purbright stepped in, hat in hand, looking at the cars as if in mild admiration rather than appraisal. I won't waste your morning, Mr. Jarvis. You were at the Civic Improvement Society lecture last night. Jarvis blinked once. Was I? Oh yes, I suppose I was. Education and all that. Terrible about Lionel. Sad thing. You arrived early. Had to. Parking's a nightmare with that scheme Henshaw was banging on about. I took a seat at the back. Mrs. Preece says you spoke with him by the pamphlet table. Jarvis gave a tiny laugh. Ivy Preece sees quarrels where other people see weather. Lionel and I exchanged pleasantries. He told me to sign his petition. I told him I don't sign petitions without reading the small print. That was all. And then I listened to Quill waffle on about tablets and souls. Lionel was doing his paper stacking. Next thing, he fell down. If you want my view, he overexcited himself. Purbright nodded as if Jarvis had offered him a cup of tea. You left before the lecture started, didn't you? Jarvis's cloth paused. No, I stayed. Teddy Vane says you hovered by the urn. Did he? Teddy's a man who likes scenes. Perhaps I did. The tea was there. Did you take any? Jarvis shook his head. Smelt like dishwater. I don't drink it. Did Mr. Henshaw? He did, yes. Burned his tongue on it like a fool. Jarvis's mouth twitched, then corrected itself into solemnity. You can't be implying I meddled with an urn in front of half the town. I'm implying nothing. Purbright's tone was mild enough to be almost apologetic. What I'm interested in is your conversation with him. He said you'd had your fill already and mentioned figures. Jarvis looked at the inspector with slow caution. So you've heard Ivy's version. Lionel loved figures. He mainlined them. If he said anything about them to me, it was because he wanted to frighten me. He was always trying to frighten someone. Did he have reason to? Jarvis shrugged. He thought the council were corrupt. He thought the school was corrupt. He thought I was corrupt. Lionel had a gift for misunderstanding ordinary commerce. Purbright leaned his back lightly against a desk. He told Mrs. Preece he planned to show papers at the lecture. Papers exposing someone cheating Flaxborough. Do you know what papers those were? I don't. Jarvis's gaze flicked to Lovejoy, then back. If he had papers, he was welcome to show them. He never did. Purbright let silence gather a moment. In the corner, a salesman pretended to arrange brochures and listened with zeal. Mr. Jarvis, Purbright said softly. Mr. Henshaw died of cyanide poisoning. Jarvis's face altered quickly. The color drained, then surged back in irritation. Poisoning. Are you saying someone dosed him in the hall? We're trying to find out how it was done and why. You had a disagreement with him. You were near the tea. You are, if I may say so, both capable and unpopular. You understand why I'm here. Jarvis put the cloth down. I do, and I don't care for it. Lionel and I had business. He supplied my invoices. That's it. If he was sniffing around my accounts, it was because he couldn't stand a man making money without first asking the town's permission. What sort of accounts? Jarvis bared teeth that were not a smile. He was on about the council's vehicle sales. Said there were phantom cars going through my books. I told him to mind his own. He said he wouldn't. That's a quarrel, Inspector, not a murder. Where did he see these phantom cars? In his head. He saw them because he wanted to. Jarvis reached into a drawer, pulled out a battered green ledger, and slapped it open. Here. Every sale. Every purchase. You're welcome to comb through it. You'll find I'm untidy, perhaps. Not murderous. Purbright did not touch the ledger. We may take a copy. Thank you. Jarvis leaned closer. Listen to me. If I wanted Lionel out of my way, I'd have waited for his petition to bore him to death. Cyanide doesn't come in tea urns. It comes from somewhere, Purbright said. And so do grudges. They left Jarvis Motors with the rain beginning again in fine needles. Behind them, the car lot settled back into oily calm, but Purbright suspected always that calm was Jarvis's best product and not his truest. Lovejoy shut the car door harder than necessary. "He's rattled, sir." "He would be, even if innocent. The town already wants him guilty." Purbright opened his notebook. "But he gave us a thread. Council vehicle sales." Lionel thought Jarvis was cheating the council, or the council was cheating itself through Jarvis. Either way, figures. Purbright looked out at the road. "Let's go back to the shop. If Lionel kept papers in a case or safe, Joyce may not know, but the safe might. We'll search with her consent and see what his truth was meant to be." As they drove toward the town, Purbright felt the case tightening from small resentments and smaller objects. A tea urn, a bottle that vanished, a chalk mark like a broken letter, and a storm of numbers no one had wanted to look at. In Flaxborough, people murdered as quietly as they lived. The trick was to notice where quietness had been arranged. By early afternoon, the town had made itself busy again, as if to prove that death in the market hall was an exception rather than a habit. Purbright and Lovejoy returned to Henshaw's stationers through a light drizzle that smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet leaves. The bell tinkled as before, but Mrs. Henshaw did not look up from the counter. She already knew who it would be. "I suppose you've come to tell me it wasn't his heart," she said, still very straight. Purbright removed his hat. "The doctor believes it was poison, Mrs. Henshaw. I'm sorry." Her face changed slowly, as if translating a sentence from a foreign tongue. "Poison in Flaxborough." She gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Well, that will keep Winifred Pocklington warm for weeks. I'm afraid it may also keep you occupied. Lionel said something about papers, about exposing someone. We need to find them." She looked at the desk, then at the shelves, then back at Purbright. Her hands gripped the counter edge. "He did say he had something. He wouldn't tell me what. I thought it was just more of that parking crusade." "May we look in his safe in case?" She hesitated long enough to show dignity had a price, then nodded. "There. Behind the calendar." Her voice softened in spite of herself. "He always said a stationer's safe should be in plain sight, because thieves only search with imagination." The safe was small and as unromantic as a biscuit tin. Lovejoy fetched a warrant form anyway, laid it on the desk, and Purbright waited while Mrs. Henshaw found a key from the chain around her neck. She opened the door with a stiff, practiced motion. Inside were ledgers, an envelope of cash for suppliers, a bundle of old letters tied with string, and a brown leather case that had been scuffed at the corners by years of municipal fervor. Mrs. Henshaw lifted the case as if it might hiss. "He took that everywhere," she said, "like a vicar with a Bible." Purbright opened it on the desk. There were papers, neatly clipped, correspondence with the council, photocopies of vehicle registration forms, typed lists of dates and chassis numbers, and a map of the council depot with 2 bays circled in red. On top lay a handwritten note in Lionel's square, impatient script. 2 Bedford vans sold 4 to 9. Only one appears in council ledger. Second reappears in Jarvis stock 18-9 as private purchase. Same plate prefix. Ask who signed disposal. Purbright read it twice, then once more slowly. Somewhere in the shop, Mrs. Henshaw had begun to breathe in short, dry pulls, like paper tearing. "So it was about that," she said. "He said they were washing things. I thought he meant accounting errors." "Accounting errors don't usually reuse vans." Lovejoy thumbed a registration sheet. "Look. Vehicle disposed by M. Quill as witness." He looked up sharply. "Dr. Quill is a governor, isn't he?" Purbright's face stayed mild. "He is, and a man who believes in proper routes, which makes improper ones interesting." Mrs. Henshaw leaned forward. "Marcus Quill, our headmaster, he hardly knows one end of a van from another." "Witnessing disposal doesn't require spanners," Purbright said gently. He lifted another sheet. The witness signature appeared again and again beside disposals to a small firm that, on later pages, resold through Jarvis Motors. So Lionel thought Jarvis and someone at the council were playing with stock, Lovejoy murmured. Lionel thought Flaxborough was being cheated, Purbright said. He found a final note dated yesterday. Show Ivy? No, she'll fuss. Show Boffin? She'll dither. Speak at lecture. Mention Quill by name if needed. Bring copy of witness sheets. Purbright sat quietly with that line a moment. He meant to say it publicly last night. Mrs. Henshaw's mouth tightened with a fresh rage that made Sorrow look pale. Then someone stopped him. Someone who knew he would speak, Purbright said. Someone who had time to act between his arrival and 8:07. He folded the note, then added softly, someone who knew how to offer him a thing he would take without suspicion. Mrs. Henshaw closed her eyes. He took tea. He always took tea when people offered it. Said refusing tea was like refusing goodwill, even if the tea was rubbish. Purbright nodded toward the case. Did he bring any tablets or drops with him? Only indigestion powders. He kept them in his coat pocket. I've not seen them since. Purbright looked at Lovejoy. We'll search the pockets if the hospital still has his clothes. Then to Mrs. Henshaw, may I take these papers? She nodded, then suddenly pressed her fingers to her lips as if she had tasted something bitter. Chalk, she said. Was the chalk mark? Him trying to write Quill? It might have been, Purbright said, though he wasn't sure. Or it might have been someone else writing to confuse that notion. Lionel was right-handed? Very. He'd never use his left unless he was carrying a box. Purbright remembered the hooked smear, clumsy, downstroke and hook without flourish. He could imagine a right hand slipping as a body weakened. He could also imagine a left hand making an awkward imitation. Either way, there was intention in it now. They left the shop with the case sealed in evidence bags. Lovejoy drove, while Purbright read the witness sheets again, the neat repetition of M. Quill, turning steadily from curiosity into motive. At council offices, a squat building of post-war gloom, the receptionist received them with the faint terror of minor authority confronted by larger. She led them into a small records room where files sat in green boxes labeled with optimistic clarity. The town clerk, Mr. Sowerby, arrived with his tie slightly crooked and his smile fully straight. Inspector, I'm sorry about Lionel. Difficult chap, but public-spirited. How can we help? Purbright showed him the witness sheets. Do you know why Dr. Quill's name appears on vehicle disposals? Sowerby adjusted his spectacles. Quill sits on the Property and Assets Subcommittee as a co-opted governor, Inspector. His role is to witness major disposals, particularly anything involving the school. Routine oversight. These disposals went through to Jarvis Motors. That would be normal. Sowerby's smile kept escaping his mouth and being pulled back. Jarvis bids for surplus vehicles. Cheapest option. The council prefers local suppliers. Did the council sell 2 Bedford vans on September 4th? Sowerby shuffled pages. We sold one. The second was scheduled but withdrawn for maintenance. Purbright's gaze stayed polite. Withdrawn, but later resold through Jarvis? I couldn't say. Records would show. He hesitated. Lionel had been asking for these files, you know. He wasn't authorized, but he made a nuisance of himself. Said there was a van in limbo. We told him to follow procedure. And did he? Purbright asked mildly. He said procedure was what people hid behind. That's Lionel. Purbright thanked him, asked for copies of the disposal logs, and watched Sowerby's hands as he fetched them. The hands shook just enough to be noticed by someone who noticed hands. Outside, Lovejoy said, Sowerby's sweating like a guilty boy. Or a worried bureaucrat who sees scandal coming, Purbright replied. We'll not decide which yet. What matters is that Lionel believed Quill was involved, and that Jarvis benefited. One of them had reason to fear a public lecture. He was poisoned before he could speak, Lovejoy said. Yes, but poison doesn't speak for itself. Purbright looked back at the council building, its windows reflecting the grey afternoon. We need to know who had access to cyanide and who had access to Lionel's trust. And we need to ask why Quill lied about speaking to Lionel last night. That wasn't fear of a heart attack. That was fear of a conversation being remembered. Lovejoy started the engine. Where to now, sir? To Dr. Quill's office. Quietly. Purbright closed his notebook. If Lionel had figured out something true, the guilty party will be trying to figure out how much we've found. People rarely sit still when their carefully arranged calm starts to rattle. Purbright arrived at St. Barnabas at 4 o'clock, when the school was in its late afternoon lull. Boys released into corridors like steam, masters recovering authority with tea. The secretary, Miss Pym, showed him to the governor's room without chatter. Dr. Quill was by the window, papers fanned before him. He turned with a quick, guarded smile. Inspector, this is unexpected. Not really, Purbright said, sitting. The post-mortem is done. Mr. Henshaw was poisoned. Quill's composure slipped, then returned. Poisoned? Who would do such a thing? Lionel kept notes. He believed council vehicle disposals were irregular. Your name appears on several witness sheets. Quill gave a faint laugh. So that is what this is. Lionel's crusades. Yes, eyewitness disposals. It is a formality. The clerk asks me to sign. I sign. I don't count vans. Yet he was certain a second Bedford left the depot and reappeared as Jarvis stock soon after. He intended to say so publicly last night. Then talk to Jarvis, Quill said sharply. He is the tradesman, not I. We have. Jarvis was at the lecture. So were you. Lionel spoke to you before you went on. You told me he didn't. A flush rose in Quill's neck. We exchanged words, yes. He was needling me about the extension. He accused me of snooping in his accounts. I said I hadn't. I didn't want that petty spat turned into town theatre. Why wasn't it relevant to a man who died minutes later? Because it was absurd. He was cross with half the council by lunchtime. Purbright nodded. So you lied for serenity. For sanity, Quill muttered. Flaxborough loves drama. Purbright watched him a moment. Did you know he had evidence with him last night? No. Did anyone on the subcommittee mention his inquiries? Only that he'd been pestering Mr. Sowerby for files. That is all. Purbright shifted. Cyanide isn't common. Do you know anyone with access? In a school, one thinks of laboratories. Quill stiffened. Our lab stores are controlled. Cyanide salts aren't lying about in jars. We are not Victorian poisoners. Still, chemistry is here, and you had a rat problem last term. Cyanide is sometimes used in fumigation. Quill stared as though a door had opened under his feet. We used a contractor. Nothing to do with me. Who signed off the contractor? The bursar. Ask him. I will. Purbright stood. One more thing. Did you ever visit the depot with Mr. Jarvis? No. I met him once at a council dinner. That's my entire relationship with him. Quill held Purbright's gaze, but a thin fear moved at the edges, like a draft behind a closed door. I'll speak to your bursar and your science master, Purbright said. Of course. You may speak to everyone. I have nothing to hide. In the corridor, Lovejoy waited. He's hot under the collar, sir. He's not lying about everything, Purbright murmured. Just about what matters to him. They found the bursar, Mr. Gillespie, in a cramped office of invoices. Gillespie was neat, mustached, and already worried. We did have rats, yes. Contractor was Greaves & Son. Standard bait, zinc phosphide, not cyanide. I signed the order. Dr. Quill never sees invoices unless I push them under his nose. Who handled the bait? Greaves delivered to the caretaker. Greaves laid it. I can fetch paperwork. Purbright thanked him and went to the laboratory wing. Mr. Harcourt, the science master, was supervising a detention with priestly solemnity. He listened, aghast, then shook his head. Cyanide? Good Lord, no. We keep a small quantity of ferrocyanide for old demonstrations, locked up. Not lethal unless you eat a bucket. Stores are logged. Purbright glanced at the logbook, noting tidy entries in a blank column for the past week. Who has keys? Harcourt, myself, and the lab assistant, Mrs. Triggs, for cleaning. Mrs. Triggs was at the lecture, Lovejoy said quietly. Harcourt blinked. Was she? She told me she had a headache. Purbright's eyes softened, not with sympathy but with attention. Where does Mrs. Triggs live? Jubilee Cottages, I think. She's a quiet sort. Never causes trouble. Quiet sorts sometimes do. Purbright closed the log. Is she here now? No. She left at 3. Said she was popping to the chemist. Which chemist? Purbright asked. The High Street one. Mr. Daly runs it. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cold and rinsed. Purbright looked down the slope toward town, where the chemist's green cross would already be lit. We'll go there, he said, quietly. If Mrs. Triggs bought something today, she may think she's buying time. I'd like to see what she believes time is for. They drove without hurry, letting the school fall behind and the town rise to meet them. The high street had the bustle of people collecting children and bread. A pram blocked the pavement in front of the hardware shop. 2 elderly men debated winter bills as if they personally set them. From time to time, Purbright caught a glance that slid away too quickly, the look of someone who knew more of last night than was proper to say. The chemist's bell gave a sharper tinkle than Henshaw's. Inside, the place was bright, smelling of lavender and disinfectant. Mr. Daly, bold and hospitable, was stacking cough mixtures. I'm looking for Mrs. Triggs, Purbright said. She may have called in. Daly's face turned careful. She did. 10 minutes ago. Bought indigestion drops and peppermint lozenges. Said her throat was raw. Paid cash. Did she seem ill? She seemed in a hurry not to be, Daly replied. Purbright thanked him and stepped outside. The drizzle had started again. He could see shoe prints heading toward the bus stop, and beyond that, the line of Jubilee Cottages. She knows we're looking, Lovejoy said. Or she's trying to look ordinary, Purbright answered. Either way, peppermint leaves a trail. We'll go and ask her why she needed it today, and why Lionel Henshaw might have needed it last night. Purbright and Lovejoy reached Jubilee Cottages while the street lamps were coming on. The cottages were low, soot-colored terraces with postage stamp gardens and a smell of coal fires that made the evening feel older than it was. Mrs. Triggs's door was ajar. A radio muttered in the kitchen. A kettle was just beginning to think about boiling. She stood at the sink with her back to them, a small woman with a tight bun and shoulders that always seemed poised to apologize for taking up space. A shopping bag lay open on the table. Peppermint lozenges sat beside indigestion drops, still in their paper wrap. Mrs. Triggs, Lovejoy said. She turned too quickly. Her eyes darted from Lovejoy to Purbright, then fixed themselves on Purbright's face as if hoping it might supply a script. Inspector, is something wrong? I'm afraid so. May we come in? She stepped aside at once, hands pressed to her apron. Of course. Please. I'd offer tea, but that's kind. But no. Purbright's voice was gentle enough to be mistaken for sympathy. He looked about the kitchen, a neatness that was both habit and defense. A child's school blazer on the chair, a ledger book half hidden under a dish towel. You were at the lecture last night. She blinked. Was I? I mean, yes. I went with Ivy Preece. She said it would do me good to get out. And you were near the pamphlet table before the lecture began. I straightened a pile, yes. Lionel always left them at angles. It vexed me. Did you speak to him? I offered a biscuit. He refused. He was in a temper. Purbright nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. He reached into his coat and laid a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was a scraping from the hall floor, a faint yellow dust clinging to it. "We found this where a bottle had stood under the pamphlet table," he said. "It contains traces of cyanide." Mrs. Triggs stared at the bag. Her mouth opened slightly and closed again. "Cyanide?" she whispered. That's awful." "It is, and it isn't. Something one comes across in bake sales." He let the silence settle, then asked in a tone almost conversational, "How is St. Barnabas's chemistry store kept?" Her eyes lifted sharply. "Locked. Mr. Harcourt keeps the key." "And you keep one for cleaning?" She hesitated. "Yes." "Do you log what you take out?" "I don't take anything out." Purbright's gaze slid to the ledger half covered on the chair. "You keep accounts carefully, though." Color rose at her throat. "That's for the household. My husband, he died. I just like to know what's where." Purbright sat down. The chair creaked like a reluctant witness. "Mrs. Triggs, Lionel Henshaw died 5 to 10 minutes after ingesting cyanide. At the lecture, he took tea, and then, according to Ivy Preece, he took something to soothe his burned tongue. A peppermint lozenge, perhaps. He liked peppermint. He kept indigestion powders in his pocket. You bought peppermint and indigestion drops today and told the chemist your throat was raw." Her hands tightened on the apron. "Lots of people buy peppermint." "Of course, but not lots of people handled cyanide, and not lots of people knew Lionel would accept a lozenge without dispute. He would accept it from someone he saw as practical, tidy, helpful, someone used to offering small remedies." "You're suggesting I poisoned him." The words came out thin, almost offended by their own shape. "I'm suggesting you had the means and the moment." Purbright leaned forward a fraction. "I'd like to understand the motive. Lionel believed the council's vehicle disposals were being manipulated. He traced a second Bedford van from the depot into Jarvis's stock. Your ledger is under a dish towel and your son's blazer is on a chair. Those are ordinary things, but they matter. A single mother on a lab assistant's pay doesn't tend to have spare money unless she finds it somewhere." Her breathing grew shallow. For a moment she seemed about to faint. Instead, she sank into the chair opposite him, as if her body had accepted what her words could not resist. "I didn't want him dead," she said at last. "I wanted him quiet." Purbright didn't move. He let her place her own emphasis. "It started small. The council asked for help cataloging old science equipment, and Mr. Sowerby said I could earn a bit extra doing evening inventories. It was just lists. Then the depot wanted someone who could read numbers properly. I did. I saw the disposals. Mr. Jarvis always made a bid, always a little under what they were worth, but no one cared. They were just old vans." She swallowed and stared at her hands. "Mr. Sowerby said the council budget was tight and he had a way of balancing things." Those were his words. Balance, as if it was a measuring scale instead of theft. "He told me to put a second van through a scrap, but note it as maintenance withdrawal. Then it went to Jarvis. Jarvis paid cash. Sowerby split it. He told me I deserved something for helping, for being reliable. I wasn't stealing from people. It was from the council, and the council wastes money every day." "People are very good at drawing lines around theft," Purbright said softly. "I used it for school fees, for shoes, for a boiler that would have cost me 2 winters. I was frightened of stopping, and frightened of being caught." She looked up with wet, furious eyes. "Lionel found it. He came to see Quill on Friday and brushed chalk on his sleeve, leaning on that wretched board. He told Quill about the missing van. Quill looked shocked, but Quill isn't stupid. He went straight to Sowerby. And Sowerby came to you." She nodded once, miserably. "He said Lionel was going to speak last night. That if he did, Jarvis would deny it and the council would blame someone small and convenient. He said I'd lose everything. He said there was a way to make Lionel pause. Just long enough to stop him talking." Purbright's eyes stayed kind but unyielding. "The cyanide. Sowerby brought a little bottle. Said it was measured, that it would make Lionel sick, nothing more. He told me to slip it under the table so Lionel could take a drop if he wanted. Then, he said, if Lionel burned his tongue, offer him a lozenge, and it would do the rest. I didn't know it would kill him. I swear to you, Inspector. Her voice broke. When he fell, I stood there like a fool and felt the floor tilt. A measured poison in a peppermint is still a poison, Purbright said, even if someone tells you it's mild. She pressed her fists to her mouth. I tried to tell Lionel after. I went to the board when people were distracted. I wanted to write Sowerby or Jarvis. But my hand was shaking, and then Lovejoy was there, and I panicked. I wiped it, but too late. Purbright closed his notebook gently. That mark may have been yours. Or his. Either way, it pointed us toward figures, which was enough. Lovejoy stood by the door, face hard with the quiet anger of a man who hated bullies more than criminals. So Sowerby planned it. He planned the method, Purbright said. We'll see what he planned beyond that. Mrs. Triggs lifted her head, a sudden desperate clarity on her face. He'll say I did it alone. He always said no one listens to women like me unless we cry or confess. We'll make sure he's listened to properly, Purbright replied. Come with us, please. They brought her to the station, and within an hour, Mr. Sowerby was seated in Purbright's office with his tie smoothed to moral perfection and his hands folded as if prayer were a municipal procedure. Jarvis was there too, summoned on the polite pretext of clarifying disposal chains. And Dr. Quill had arrived white-faced, outraged at being treated like part of the furniture in someone else's scandal. Purbright poured tea for all of them, even Jarvis, who accepted it with the wary gratitude of a man who suspects cups can bite. He spoke without flourish. Lionel Henshaw traced a missing council van to Jarvis Motors. He intended to say so publicly last night and to name those he believed responsible. The van was not missing by error. It was disposed of twice, once on paper, once in fact. Mr. Sowerby arranged the paperwork. Mr. Jarvis provided the convenient market. Mrs. Triggs kept the numbers aligned and was paid for her silence. He nodded toward Mrs. Triggs, who sat as if braced against a storm. When Lionel threatened to expose it, Mr. Sowerby provided cyanide under the guise of a harmless sickness and persuaded Mrs. Triggs to administer it via a peppermint lozenge. She believed it would delay him. It killed him. Sowerby's face had been shrinking as Purbright spoke, like a man in too hot water. Now it lifted in a small, stubborn flare. This is ridiculous. A fantasy built on a dead man's scribbles and a frightened woman's tale. Purbright looked at him calmly. We have your witness signatures, your disposal logs, and the cash trail into your overdrawn account, which suddenly improved in September. The lab store shows a small loss of cyanide compound from St. Barnabas. The chemist can confirm Mrs. Triggs bought peppermint today to steady herself. She has told us your words. If you wish to add your own, I'm listening. Jarvis's jaw worked. Sowerby, you idiot, he said softly, not to Purbright, but to the ceiling. You told me it was clean. It was clean until you started relisting vans with the same plate prefix, Purbright said, almost mildly. Lionel was a stationer, Mr. Jarvis. He noticed details because he sold them for a living. Quill stared at Sowerby with a kind of disgust that was almost grief. You used my name, he said hoarsely. You used me as a witness to theft, and then you let the town think I was a murderer. Sowerby's posture cracked. You signed without reading, he burst out. Every time. You were pleased to be consulted and never looked. You want to talk about responsibility. Purbright lifted a hand politely. All of you have your share to describe to the magistrate, but only one of you arranged a death. He turned to Lovejoy. Sergeant. Lovejoy stood, already holding the cuffs. Sowerby did not fight. He only sagged, as if the weight he'd carried in secret had finally become public, and therefore heavier. By the next morning, Flaxborough had a new shape for its chatter. The council clerk had been arrested. Jarvis's yard was shut pending inquiries. People who had confidently blamed Quill now remembered they had always found Sowerby a bit slippery. Mrs. Pocklington declared herself shocked on the telephone in tones suggesting she was half delighted to be right about something after all. Mrs. Henshaw received the news like a stiff wind. It bent her, but did not break her. She went to the shop, opened as usual, and when a child asked for a ruler, she sold it with the same crisp care Lionel had taught her, only her eyes were tighter at the corners. Purbright returned to his paperwork. His pen moved quietly. Lovejoy hovered in the doorway. "Sir," he said, "you were right about the smallness." Purbright looked up. "Most large things in Flaxborough are made of small ones, Sergeant. A peppermint, a signature not read. A tidy man who couldn't bear untidy figures." He capped his pen, stacked the files, and glanced out at Booth Street, resuming itself with a faint, stubborn cheer. The town would heal, but it would remember the taste of this week for a while. Bitter, like almonds you didn't ask for. Purbright took up the next report, patient as ever, and let the rain begin again without comment.